Perhaps you remember at DreamHack Tours where I had that baguette and I compared it to Envious and I compared the table to Fnatic and I smashed the baguette, I broke it over the table. Well, in your tours of Alpha Draft, you could break their bank playing fantasy esports and winning sick cash money. Got francs for days. I'm not talking about hot dogs for you Americans. So if you could emulate the success of really good fantasy players, you could get the kind of money that you'd need to spend on a great date if you were to beat mSx, whoever she might be. See what I did there? mSx, mSx. Anyway, we're into the video. So mSx, one of the all-time great 1.6 players, has returned to competitive play, this time in CSGO, and he'll be playing for a team called Xeno Dragons, featuring a bunch of former teammates of his. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is one of the returns that was very unexpected. I did not think that this player would be coming back, but is one I'm very excited for. Whereas for some of the other ones, some of the MTW players, for example, who were great players, I don't have that high expectations for them coming back. This is a player who was a genius level talent, extremely talented player. And he's someone where he was a hard carry. He was one of the players who, for most of his career, didn't play with so much talent around him, yet still accomplished some pretty good results relative to that talent. And just in terms of pure skill for a couple of years, was exceptionally good. Now, first of all, one of the great things about this player, for newer people, anyone who's played any CS 1.6 or can appreciate 1.6 if you watch frags of it, is that he has one of the best frag movies ever made. And I'll link that up here. It was made by a guy called Fistor, who'd made a bunch of movies in the French scene and who was a good movie maker. And this movie is absolutely one of my top 5 of all time. It's a really incredible movie. It features mostly POV footage, so it's really high quality and the frags are exceptional in it. This movie is so good that in the latter years of 1.6 when it came out, I actually talked to both Neo and Forrest and asked them if they'd seen this movie, and I forget if they both had, but eventually they did watch it, and then followed up, and both of them said, like, no, the kills in that movie were absolutely insane. That guy was utterly ridiculously good. Not only that, but in, I think it was 2012, I actually wrote an article for Fragbite, which I will link in the description box below, which was about a 13-month span where mSx's team, Emulate, his most famous team at least, had this really sick run of results where they had, it was about 13 months, and they won a major, they won WCG, they got top 3 at a Game Goon, and they had top 3 at a DreamHack Win Turn, so they had 3 international top 3s in a row, which was obviously big time against top level teams. They had 2 top finishes in the top 8 outside of those ones I've already mentioned, and they won $74,000 as a team. So pretty good little run, and that actually ended up accounting for over 85% of the total career earnings of mSx. So you can see that this was primarily the period where he really got work done because he had the right team around him, it was the right environment, and his talent was able to really blossom and flourish in a way it wouldn't have otherwise. In fact, I think it was 4 top 3 finishes overall in a row at international tournaments. So for most other players, like I've mentioned on past 2 episodes, I've tried not to just go into every single result, but since mSx was the full-on hard carry of this team, his team's results pretty much are his results in that sense. So the first place we really started to see him was in 2007. And interestingly enough, in 2007, there was no attention on him for the first half of the year because his team wasn't particularly good. Like, they went to the Samsung European Championships, which was the European edition of the World Cyber Games, which all the best European teams. They only finished top 8 there. Back home in France, they went to Gamers Assembly, which is a French-only LAN, only finished top 8 there. So then at ESWC, one of the majors, but held in France, his team managed to upset the NOA team, who actually made it to the final there, beating them very narrowly on Inferno. But then they lost to the Dignitas team, who were from the UK. Also a very narrow game, starting 16 on Train. And that was actually after they'd had a 12-3 first half. So nothing particularly great to talk home about. Nice little upset win. Didn't go beyond that, though. Didn't make the playoffs. Just went out in the group stage. But then the next big tournament after that was Game Goon in Spain. And the whole thing about this Game Goon in 2007 is it was incredibly stacked, but it wasn't a major. Like, it didn't have the stature and prestige and the history of being a major, but it was an incredibly stacked tournament. And actually, This team, Emulate, managed to finish third place here, and this is where you really started to take a note internationally of mSx, because they beat the Finns, who'd been the best team earlier in the year, the Natu and Lurpus's team, 69 and 28E. They beat them on Dust 2, and they lost to Fnatic. Oh no, actually they beat Fnatic on Nuke in the upper bracket. I think it would have been the semi-final at that point in time, and mSx went crazy in this game. There was a POV demo of it where his cult was nuts, he was flanking them, he was winning one of X situations. So they managed to beat Fnatic, who actually would end up winning this tournament and actually would become the best team of the year overall. This is the Fnatic that had Forest, they had actually Inns was in their team at that point in time, they had DSN, they had Khan. Then, in the upper bracket final, they played MIBR, who was obviously one of the best teams in the world, a world-class level team, but they lost to them. And then the lower bracket final, they had to rematch Fnatic, and this time, Fnatic was a fantastic team. Fnatic beat them and would go on to win the tournament. So, third place, still a very good performance, and mSx particularly had gone nuts in this tournament and really shown that he was a high-quality player. Then, later that year, the World Cyber Games came along, and this is another one of the majors. Winning the World Cyber Games gold medal was a huge deal in CS 1.6. So at this tournament, in the group stage, they again managed to upset NOA. This time they beat them 16-14 on Dust 2 in the group stage. But likewise, they themselves then lost also to a lesser team than them, which is they lost to K23, which is Adren, the Kazakhstani player, Adren's Kazakhstani team, who were known as like a good upset team, but they never made it super deep in tournaments in general. So they lost to them 14-16 on Train. Funnily enough, Train obviously a map that they would have difficulties on at times. Then going through the bracket stage, they beat the German team, which is like a mixed team of alternate mouse players, not bad. They beat Istro, the Korean team, who were good, but this was one of the years where they hadn't quite gone beast mode. It wasn't until the next year that they were really, really sick. And interestingly enough, they got to beat Istro in only I think it would have been the round of 8 at that point in time. So they were through to the top 4 already. So it's already a big result for this Emulate team. Amazingly, they only had to play Amazing Gaming, this team from Ukraine. And at that point in time, Ukraine had never made top 4 major, ever. And this was Starix and a bunch of players you won't know. Starix and Blade, basically. You won't know the other players, though. And so it was incredible that team had even made it that far. They'd made it that far by being an upset team, actually. And amazingly, the Emulate team didn't stomp this Amazing Gaming team. It was a 2-1 series. First 2 maps were both 16-14s. They won on Dust 2, lost on Inferno, and won a stomp on Nuke. So they got through to the final already. And in the final, they ended up playing NOA, the team they'd upset in the group stage. They'd already upset them previously. NOA had made the final of ESWC. NOA was one of the world-class teams. It was this team that had Zonic, Sunder, Ave. So, very special team. But this team hadn't quite figured out how to win yet. And amazingly, in the final, Emulate beat them 2-0. They beat them on Inferno handedly, and then they smashed them on Dust 2. And the whole storyline for this particular tournament was mSx, because this was one of the most hard carry tournament performances in the history of Counter-Strike. This one tournament, I think he like broke the record on the stats program we had back then, GameSense, for like the best ever stats for one tournament, the best rating, the best overall number of like plus minus, best frags per round. He had all these crazy stats because he went absolutely mental. And this final particularly, he just dominated. His AWP, his AK. The NOA team was a good team. They were a very good tactical team, and they could do nothing against this guy. He was an absolute beast. And it wasn't that his whole team was incredible. They were good, but he was just an absolute monster in this tournament. Now, unfortunately, even though they won this tournament, even though he showed himself to be one of the best players in the world, this is one of the all-time great flukes. And the reason why we have to say that is not just because Emulate shouldn't have won most of these matches, but then you look at all the other things that had to go essentially indirectly in their favour that had nothing to do with their control, that helped them have such a path to win the tournament. Because coming into the tournament, the favourites for this event would have been Pentagram, the ones who won ESWC, who'd won IEM earlier in the year. One of the all-time great teams, Neo, Taz, the Poles. But they got beat in the first round of the playoffs by the Finns, by Lurpus's team, Rockat. Now, the Finns themselves then went on to the next round, taking essentially the seed of the Poles. And in the next round, they played Amazing Gaming and got upset in an incredibly close match, which they were so close to winning. So Amazing Gaming benefited from a couple of upsets themselves to get there. So there's 2 of the potential favourites out of the tournament, and the Finns have been the best at the beginning of the year, at the very beginning of the year. So there's 2 of the year's best teams out already. Fnatic, the team who would, from Game Goon onwards, be the best team in the world, and who were considered overall the best team in the world at this point, actually went out in the group stage due to some incredible upsets. And on top of that, when the Emulate guys got to play Istro in the quarterfinals, they would have been playing Meet Your Makers Norway, which was Real, the all-time great player, his team. But the reason they didn't get to play against Real's team is because Istro upset them by sort of rule cheating, where they kept claiming that the MYM players had been crouch hopping at a time when, at this point in time, very briefly, it was banned by this tournament, WCG, even though they themselves, Istro, were doing it. And because the admins, in the end, were Koreans, they actually sided with Istro and gave them this bullshit third map where they should have just lost 2 maps and they shouldn't have never played there. So basically, you look at the way the tournament went. If they'd have played Pentagram, they'd have very likely lost. If they'd have played Fnatic, they'd have very likely lost. These teams get knocked out by other teams. If they'd have played the Finns, that would have been a very interesting game. But the Finns got upset by A Gaming. MYM would have been a favourite to beat them, but MYM got upset by Istro. So as a result, they got to play Istro, they got to play A Gaming, and then in the final, the only elite team left was NOA, a team that they'd beaten twice before in upsets, and even more so, a truly great world-class team, but who hadn't quite yet figured out how to be a champion. They wouldn't become a true champion until the next year. So everything had to go that way. And on top of that, then they needed mSx to go ultra god mode and have one of the sickest tournaments ever. So you can see why that's one of the all-time great flukes. But at the end of the year, there was another tournament, international tournament, DreamHack Winter. And at the time, DreamHack wasn't a major, and DreamHack wasn't as big as it is now, but it was still a good medium-sized tournament. And obviously, because of Swedish teams, it would always have good teams in attendance. So at this tournament, they managed to thrash SK, the SK of Vale and Tentpole, a very sick team. They thrashed them. They managed to beat NOA. Again, but this time actually, admittedly, anyway, didn't have their in-game leader. They had Wimp as a stand-in, so that wasn't as sick, and that was an overtime game on Train. Train was always a tough map for this team to play. Then they lost to MIBR, who actually turned out to be one of the kryptonites for this team. They always lost to MIBR, so they lost to them on Nuke, and they lost in the lower bracket final to SK. Again, just like Fnatic had come from the lower bracket to beat them at Game Good and make them have to finish third, SK did the same here, and it would be on Dust 2 this time, one of the better maps for Emulate. In early 2008, it looked as though that little run of 3 international tournaments, who cares about that? Because in early 2008, the team was bombing and things were going badly now. And what happened was there was a bunch of LANs in France where this team went, and they weren't even the best team in France. They went to this Atomic Riso LAN and lost twice to Dimension 4, who weren't the best French team. They went to Miage LAN, only finished top 6 there, lost to a bunch of teams, including a team called DRU, who were just nobodies. They didn't even qualify for the IEM2 finals, which is the next major, but at the same tournament, they held the next Samsung European Championships. They went there, and they would have another third. They would have their 4th international top 3 in a row, picking it up from the form that was terrible domestically and online. And in this tournament, they managed to beat Roccat, who were essentially the Finns that they'd beaten the year before. This time on Nuke. They lost to the Poles, though, on Train, and they got through the lower bracket, but then lost to the Poles again. So they finished 3rd again, but that was the end of their sick run. After that, even though initially they actually did all right in terms of in France again, they had some decent results. There would then be an ESWC Masters tournament, which wasn't the same as ESWC, but it was like a medium-sized event, and they lost there to Roccat. Roccat was another team that got a lot of wins over them. They went to E-Stars Seoul, lost to Lunatic High there, and then the last really significant result of this run was they went to ESWC, the second major of the year, and again they lost to Roccat. Somehow they got in a situation where they got to the round of 8, and this is a really interesting game. They played the Poles, who'd beaten them earlier in the year at this Samsung European Championship, and they went a full 3 maps with them, and they had a chance to win this series. They smashed the first map, Dust 2, one of their best maps. mSx went mental on this map. He was really, really high quality. The second map was really close. I think it was Train, and this had a pause controversy, where they were leading, but then there was some weird scenario, like it was claimed that it was paused, and then someone unpaused and paused, like as a player was coming in from the polls, so they could kill them. Some weird scenario happened. There was this huge controversy because obviously the admins were French, so everyone was thinking that they were going to be biased to them. But anyway, whatever decision happened, some rounds got taken off Emulate, as I seem to remember. The Poles won this map, and then the Poles ultra smashed the third map, Nuke. And so actually, this team got denied another miracle run where they could have had a top 4 in a major, and they got denied in the round of 8 this time. From there onwards, mSx's career was irrelevant in terms of results and team accomplishments. You would still see him at tournaments, and he would still have rounds that were incredible. Like in 2010 at the IEM World Championship, he had like some rounds that were utterly incredible versus like the Evil Geniuses team, etc. But 2009, 2010, 2011 was essentially just a bust. There was no good results there. All the international tournaments he went to, he never made top placings. The best placing was a 6th place in 2010 at the European Championships. That's it. Otherwise, he was finishing outside of the top 8, usually, even at most of these tournaments. There was, that's pretty much all the results. Even back in France, he was losing most of the lands. It was very rare he won lands. He changed teams a few times. Like, some of his players dropped out of his teams, and then his teams became Oxmos, and then they became other lineups. They were called Virus eventually. So from there on, it wasn't that interesting, really. And a whole bunch of lands that weren't that good. He did, towards the end of 2011, he won a big French land, but that's about it. Interestingly, by 2011 comes around, he was playing at lands where Kiyashima was actually playing, the player that we now know from LDLC and Envious. He was playing at those lands, and sometimes mSx's teams placed ahead of him, but that's because Kiyashima wasn't a famous player back then. And probably the capper for how poor the end of mSx's career was, he finished 13th to 16th at NESWC with Virus, so not impressive stuff at all. They tried at the end of 2011 to make a super team, which is at the time the two great players of that era in France was mSx and Sixer, both sick AWPers, and they'd never played together. So they together made the super team of eSahara, but that's it. This team never managed to accomplish anything of note. I think they went to a DreamHack Winter. They didn't particularly do much there, and they wouldn't even play very long. And actually, mSx retired in 2011, as I seem to remember. Now, the classic lineup he played with in Emulate was with Hearts, who obviously later went on to be a good player in terms of an in-game leader and lead Clan Mystic to the ESWC title in 2013 in CSGO. He played with Matt. He played with a guy called Irek, who later became a manager in Titan. You might remember he had to play after Kaylee was banned at the end of 2014. And he played with a player called Rigo with an exclamation point instead of an I. Now, interestingly, domestically, he lost lots of lands to Major and Sixer, who both just recently came back in a French lineup. And for most of his career, he stuck with Matt and Rigo. Those are the guys who were the teammates he mainly stuck with, while Hearts and Irek actually went off elsewhere. Like, they went off to Millennium lineups and different teams. And in general, after that period, Hearts had more success after they broke up than mSx did, because Hearts was the in-game leader and he had good teams. And actually, like I said, he went on to win an ESWC in CSGO, even though that wasn't actually... I mean, I guess it was sort of a major, but that's because it's before we had the majors in CSGO, so it was sort of one of the bigger tournaments, which is obviously a big result. And interestingly, a fluke in similar fashion to the old Emulate one, except he didn't have mSx. He had Apex, he had Kiyashima. Let me think, is that right? Yeah, that's right. So, the interesting thing about mSx's career is, like I say, even though in those latter years he wasn't accomplishing much, you would still see games where he was still a monster. But he didn't have because he came from France as a region was quite underdeveloped, not least because France had the best Source teams at this point in time. So all their talent was playing Source, and all the new players were going into Source. So they didn't have that big a CS 1.6 team, so they didn't have the talent to replenish around him, and then they would stick with these same lineups. mSx was a player who seemed like one of those weird players. You got a few of them, like a Real, where they just want to play sometimes, and they don't want to play 100% full time, and they play with certain teammates, and they're very distant to the community, and as a result, it doesn't seem like they just try to be in the best team at all time and get the right teammates around them. They just want to play with certain people that they like. In fact, famously, mSx was someone who never did interviews. He never spoke English. He almost never interacted with the community whatsoever. And you could do that if you were a pro player. You could just be sick, have the odd demo come out, and just play in the tournaments and shut up. Like, that's what was crazy about the world back then. So we never really got to know much about him, actually. Thankfully, a movie was made about him at the end. Now, in terms of his skills, he was one of the most skilled players ever. Like, in terms of just raw skill, he'd be a top 10 player of all time. He probably can't be that high, I imagine. I haven't ever made that list for 1.6, just because... I mean, he didn't really have the accomplishments, but then again, he was an incredibly good player. And his peak in terms of even accomplishments was only, like I said, like 13 months. But he was a very sick individual player. He was one of the great hard carries, especially, like I said, that World Cyber Games 2007 tournament is one of the best hard carry performances I've ever seen. He was a sick AWPer, but he was also a monster rifler and very good with pistols. He was very much like an Olaf M of his day in many ways. Like, he had really good rifle spray where it would look like he was bursting to the head, but actually that was his spraying, and he would just get the kill before he'd have to burst more than 5 or 6 bullets. Really nice spray with both guns, the Colt and the AK, and he had a very good deagle as well. He would hit those crazy 1 deags 2 or 3 in a row and win rounds single-handedly doing so. Now, in Xenodragons coming to CSGO, interestingly, every member of this team was an ex-teammate of his, just not all at the same time. So, we've got Matt and Irek, who were his teammates in Emulate, like I said, and I reckon in that case later on in Oxmos. And Drizzer was a teammate of his from Oxmos later, but somebody who didn't have that great a career otherwise. And Yikon, who also didn't play very much in 1.6 in terms of top teams, who was a teammate of mSx's from Virus towards the end. So every single one of these players is people he knows, people he's friendly with. The only downside to mSx coming back is, like I said, because he always was a bit of a strange bird in that sense. Like, he wasn't someone who seemed to want to be famous or seemed to care that much about being like the absolute best and winning and being on the best teams. It does feel as though maybe he'll just come back and play because these are friends of his, or he wants to compete again, or he likes to play a bit. But will that mean he has the drive to be the best? Will he love the game enough to want to be the best? Will he get the chance to be in top teams? Now, the reason this is very exciting is because if he gets very good, and if even one or two of those others gets good, forget this team, maybe one day we could see mSx playing with the Existence and Shocks type lineups of Titan. Maybe we could see someone like Drizzer start to play with these teams. Maybe this is where the French scene gets replenished, so it's not just Envious, and then Envious is kind of cannibalizing Titan and all the teams below them to get all the best players, and there only being 6 or 7 top players, and Titan nearly always having 4 or 5, Envious having 4 or 5 of them at all times. That's what would be exciting, because if we had a world where we had Kenny S, mSx, and Shocks, and they were all incredible players, now you'd get even more excitement from the French-Belgian scene, because obviously, unfortunately, they're mainly going to always stick with themselves. They're not going to get people who speak English. They're not going to get international teams. They're going to stick with French and Belgian players, not least because that's going to fit their style of play. Like in the Envious team, they never have like excellent natural chemistry and communication because they just play off each other so much. In the Titan teams, they've always had such good tactics and such extreme tactics when Existence was in game leader that they need to have very good communication in that sense, and Existence doesn't speak great English. So he speaks all right English, he just doesn't like to speak English. So this is why it's interesting mSx coming back. But like I say, he is one of the all-time great players, a very skilled player, and I would recommend you watch that movie and read the article. Thanks all for draft.